Alright, so I've opened up Visual Studio on the Mac. I'm going to start a new project. We'll come back later and look at all these different options, but right now I want to create a multi-platform app. We're going to create a blank Forms app in C#, and I'm going to click Next. I'm going to give my app a name. I'm going to call it Workflow Demo 1. Then we have an organization identifier. This is a reverse URL, so if our organization was called smcc.com, the organization identifier would be the reverse of that of com.smcc. Feel free to use that as your organization identifier. Then in target platforms, we're going to create an app that is both for Android and iOS. And we're going to use for our shared code the .NET standard. That's what we'll primarily use in here. That's sort of a newer approach in Xamarin. It replaced something called portable class libraries. And we can also use the shared library as an option. We'll talk more about those options down the road. But for now, let's use the .NET standard. I'm going to click the Next button. Notice that in my project name, it took the spaces out and named it Workflow Demo 1. That'll be the name of the project. And I can decide where I want that to be saved. And I'm going to click Create. So here's our project. We have Workflow Demo 1 project. It has 3 sections. The Workflow Demo 1 is our shared area. This is going to contain our main page XAML. And the main page XAML is our interface. And then we're going to write code behind that in the main page XAML.cs. There's also an apps XAML, which basically controls which forms are being used and so forth, because we can't have multiple forms or multiple XAML files. Then there's a section here for Android and a section for iOS. You notice the Android is bolder. That's because by default, the Android is set up as the startup project. So if we were to test this, it would run it on an Android emulator. I can, however, come over to iOS and right-click on that and choose Set as Startup Project. And now that's bold, and I can make that my run project when I want to test it. I'm going to go back to Android, set that as the startup project. Each of these have folders in them for assets and properties and resources and so forth. If we want to bring in images to use in our applications, we're going to bring in images that are sized for Android with some specific resolutions. And we would do the same thing for iOS. There's a resource folder here as well where images would go into. I'm just going to collapse those because in this particular project, we're not going to do anything with those 2 areas. We're going to do everything in our shared code and write a simple app for both Android and iOS. So what I'm looking at here in my tab is the main page XAML, which is the interface. And over here, we can see what that interface would look like in a preview. Now I'm getting a little error here saying your iOS application project must reference the Xamarin Forms NuGet in order to use the previewer. So NuGet is a collection of code projects that can be brought into your application and used. And there's a lot of them. But to add in the NuGet, we're going to go to the project menu and choose Add NuGet Package. And you could search here for Xamarin Forms. It comes up because that's the last one I had brought in on another project. But normally I would probably type Xamarin Forms here. Here's my Xamarin Forms NuGet package. I'm going to select that and just choose Install Package. I'm going to accept it, and it's going to add that in. Then we'll go to the Build menu and just choose Build All. And you can watch in this area here the activities going on. So notice it's building the solution. And you can see a progress bar here. So I got a bunch of warnings. At this point, I'm going to ignore those warnings. Those will get fixed as we go along. But notice that now we are seeing the preview so that NuGet package is in place and the previewer is now working. And I could view this either for iOS or I could also view what it would look like on Android. Go back to our iOS. Even though we're working in the Android as our default, maybe I should show Android then. Our interface is defined by tags that are XAML tags. And if you worked in HTML or CSS, you've used tags. When we created our C# projects, we used Windows Forms, where we dragged and dropped objects onto our form and set the attributes and so forth. What was happening behind the scenes, if you remember when we did that, was it was creating some code for us based on our actions of dragging and dropping and setting those properties. In Xamarin, we don't have the luxury of the dragging and dropping feature. We have to write the code. And this is going to seem more problematic and more difficult at first than it really is. You'll get used to it fairly quickly. Code is generally written with tags that begin and end an object. And so right now, everything in our project is in a content page. And inside that content page is a stack layout. A stack layout lets us, basically as it describes, lay out our page so that things are stacked on top of one another. There's right now only one item in that stack, and that is a label. And that's where we're seeing the text of welcome to Xamarin.Forms. So let's modify things a little bit. We can add attributes to these objects. So my stack layout is an object. I'm going to change the background color of that by typing in background color in front of the greater than symbol, and I can choose a color. I'm going to choose silver as my color. And notice when I do that, my preview shows the change. And then for the label, we have Welcome to Xamarin Forms. We have horizontal options and vertical options. I'm just going to bring this down on the next page. Maybe I can narrow this a little bit so we can have a little more real estate space here. Okay, so my vertical options equals center and expand. I'm just going to add some more attributes inside this label tag. Now notice the stack layout has an opening tag and a closing tag that has a slash in front of the term. Same with content page, and we have a slash content page. The label is all one. So I have a label, and then I have a slash closing tag. So it's all basically in one group of attributes within that label. I'm going to add a background color here as well. And this one I'll choose to be lime. And then we're going to set a text color. The text color is going to be black. Right now our label is conforming to the text. It's sort of that auto size property that we saw in Windows Forms. So I'm going to set a height request of 100 and a width request of 300. Then we'll drop down the next line here. You see our label's gotten much bigger, but the text of the label is in the upper left-hand corner. So I'm going to center that text. And there's a attribute for horizontal text alignment. Again, I'm going to set that to center. And then there's also a vertical text alignment. And I'll set that to center. So now my text is centered. I also want to change the font face and the attributes a little bit here. So we're going to change the font family to be Arial. And then the font attributes to be bold. All right, so there is our new label, our modified label. It's lime green, it's got the text in the center, both horizontal and vertical. It's 300 by 100 units. I'm going to add another item to our stack, and that's going to be a button. I'm going to give the button a name. And the attribute for name is x:\name equals, and it's going to call it, I'm going to use my Hungarian notation, BTN SMCC. It's going to have a width request of 150 a height request of 50, text of SMCC, background color is going to equal blue, the text color is going to equal white, and then I'm going to add a event to this of clicked, and it's going to equal SMCC underscore clicked. I need my closing tag here, so I do a slash and the greater than, and we'll notice that the button appears down here on the bottom as part of our stack. Since we didn't specify that it should be centered, it simply took up residence at the very bottom of our stack. Now, it's going from left to right margin. I'm going to add in another attribute here, and that is going to be the horizontal options. And I'm simply going to set that to center. So now my button's 150 wide and 50 high. I want to add another button, so I'm just going to copy this and paste. I'm going to set this to BTN ASU as the name. I'm going to set the text to ASU. I'm going to set the clicked event to ASU underscore clicked. So I have both buttons now at the bottom. Again, these are stacking at the bottom. I want to bring them up a little bit, so I'm going to add one more item here, and that is a box view, which is just really a rectangle. And all I'm going to set here is the height request of 50. And again, I want my slash greater than symbol. And so notice how that now brought these buttons up a little bit. That's my interface. So I need to do one more thing, and that is I want to name my label so I can refer to it in code. So I'm going to add an xname equals, and we'll call it LBL campus. All right, so I need to write the code behind for these buttons to do something for these two events of SMCC clicked and ASU clicked. So we're going to go over to the main page.xaml CS tab. You can also get to it here by double clicking in our file list. And this will look pretty familiar. It looks very similar to what we had in Windows. I'm going to add a private void. It's not going to return anything, but we have that name of SMCC underscore clicked. And our arguments, basically what we had in our Windows projects, we have an object named sender, and we have event args we'll call E. I'm going to do my brackets and write my code in between. Now the code's going to look very similar as well to what we've done before. Nothing new here. Again, we're writing code in C#. So LBL campus dot text equals South Mountain CC. And of course I need my semicolon. Let's change the background color. So LBL campus dot background color equals color dot, and we'll make it orange. LBL campus dot text color equals color dot white. Now remember in our Windows projects we had back color and fore color. So the attributes in our XAML objects are slightly different. Here we have background color and text color. And one more thing I'm going to do is lbl campus dot font size equals 24. Okay, that's my event procedure for smcc underscore clicked. I'm just going to copy this and paste it. And here we want ASU clicked. I'm going to change my text to Arizona State University. Let's change the color for the background to gold and the color for the text color to maroon. Now, of course, this is not the ASU gold and the ASU maroon specifics. We can use RGB values here. This will give us an idea of gold and maroon. And I'm going to change the font size, because the text is a little bit larger, to 21. Okay, so there's my C#. I'm going to go to the Build menu and choose Build All. This will build both Android and iOS at the same time. I could do those individually simply by testing both the Android and the iOS with the emulator. But it comes back and says build successful. If there's an error somewhere in our code, it would display an error. And that error could be in the XAML code, it could be in the C# code. And down at the bottom we have a errors section that would turn red, and we could then view any errors or warnings in our project. Okay, since it built successfully on both, I'm going to test the Android. So right now Android is my startup. I can choose over here what I want to do. I'm going to do a debug of Android. There's also other options in terms of releasing. So if you're getting ready to put something in the store, to use a release. And for Android, we just simply use debug. And then I can choose which emulator I want to debug this on. So I have by default an Android accelerated Oreo emulator. That was installed. We installed Xamarin. I went in earlier, and I'll show you how to do this in a future video, of creating one for Galaxy S9. That's the phone that I have, so I want to be able to test things for my phone. You can use the default one when you're testing this. I'm going to go ahead and use my Galaxy 9. I already have that emulator open, so it won't take long for this to test. I'm going to click the Run button here, and I watch this area again, make sure it builds successfully for the Android, and then it will install it onto the emulator. And down the status bar, I can see my emulator down here. I'm going to bring it up. So there's my emulator. I had it open from an earlier project. And there's my project running on the emulator. I can click the SMCC button, and I can click the ASU button, and they both work. We can also cable our Android phone to our Mac and transfer the files that way. Or I can generate a release of a .apk file and mail that to myself and install it once I receive it in my email. For now, we're going to work just in the emulators. I'll show you later how to set up and test your creations on an actual device, both Android and iOS. I just like to leave my emulators running because I'm probably going to make changes and come back and want to test it again. So I don't close the emulator. What I do instead is I'm just going to hide it, and then I'm going to stop my project here in Visual Studio. Let's test it on the iOS. So I'm going to come back over here and make this my startup project. In my workflow, I'm choosing debug, and then I can choose the emulator that I want. I'm going to run this on the iPhone 8. I'm going to go ahead and choose 11.1. And now we'll compile it. The build was successful. It is now launching the emulator, and I can once again test. So it's working both for Android and iOS, and I can continue to make changes, change the XAML, change the C# and continue to test. That's the process we'll go through in creating applications. I'm going to come back to Visual Studio and stop the launch, and then I can come back in here and continue to work on either the XAML or the C#.